studying the seerah. When you study the seerah, then and only then can you defend the honor of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We need to take a short break. We'll come right back and continue talking about the sources of the seerah. Stay with us. Welcome back. We were discussing the reasons for studying the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and realize that this science is a very, very old science in Islam. In fact, the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it is narrated that they would teach their children stories from the seerah, just like they would teach them surahs from the Quran. They would ask them to memorize stories from the seerah, just like they would ask them to memorize surahs from the Quran. Because the Quran and the Sunnah, these two are the ultimate sources of our religion. And the Sunnah, of course, is the seerah. The Sunnah meaning the characteristics of the Prophet ﷺ, that is the biography. And so, from an early age, the companions would teach their children the Quran and the Sunnah. They would teach them surahs from the Quran, and they would teach them stories from the seerah. Now, we are living 1,430 years roughly after the hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ. The question arises, how do we know the seerah? Where do we get our information from? What is the sources of the biography of the Prophet ﷺ? Well, there are many sources, but to name just a few to simplify our talk. First and foremost, the most important source of seerah, and the most authentic source of seerah, and the most blessed source of seerah is the Quran itself. The Quran refers to a number of incidents that occurred in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. The Quran talks about the battle of Badr, and the battle of Uhud, and the battle of Tabuk, and the battle of Ahzab. The Quran talks about the hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ. The Quran talks about some of the things that happened in the childhood of the Prophet ﷺ. The Quran talks about even some of the pre-Islamic things that happened. For example, the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destroyed the elephants that were meant to attack the Kaaba. Allah mentions this, أَلَمْ تَرَ كَيْفَ فَعَلَ رَبُّكَ بِأَصْحَابِ الْفِيلِ. Do you not see how Allah took care of the people of the elephants? Who are the people of the elephants? They are a group of people who wanted to destroy the Kaaba before the birth of the Prophet ﷺ. Allah mentions it in the Quran, and that's a source of seerah. So the Quran is the most blessed and the most authentic and the most authoritative source of the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. The second source are the famous books of hadith. The Sahih of Bukhari, the Sahih of Muslim, the famous Sunans and the famous Musnads. These are the classical books of hadith. The hadith is a statement of the Prophet ﷺ. And every statement is a portion of the seerah. The seerah is the whole life. And every hadith that we study is one bit, one snapshot, one utterance of the Prophet ﷺ. And sometimes we find an incident connected to that utterance. Sometimes we find, because this happened, the Prophet ﷺ said that. Or due to such an incident that occurred, the Prophet ﷺ said that. And so we find the hadith attached to a story. And so the story becomes a part of the seerah. And of course, every hadith in and of itself is also a part of the seerah, because it is something that the Prophet ﷺ said. Another source of the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ are the books specifically written for the seerah. There are many, many classical books that were written just to compile the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. Some of these books, the earliest books ever written about the seerah, were compiled in the lifetime of the sons of the companions. Not the companions themselves. Generally, the companions themselves did not write down much. They wrote down only a few things. But they memorized a lot, and they witnessed a lot. So their children, they wrote down manuscripts, and they wrote down bits and portions of the seerah. And some of these bits and portions were then transcribed to later generations. And they were absorbed by future generations. Until a man came along by the name of Muhammad ibn Ishaq. Muhammad ibn Ishaq, he was from Medina. And he was born and raised in Medina. And he lived his life amongst the sons and the grandsons of the companion. And he decided to write a huge book about the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. And so he wrote a very large and voluminous work, which became known as the Seerah of Ibn Ishaq, because his name was Muhammad ibn Ishaq, and so it was called the Seerah of Ibn Ishaq. And he died in the year 150 Hijrah. So 150 Hijrah, very early on, meaning he lived in the 90s, 100, 110, less than 100 years after the Prophet ﷺ, he is a full adult man, he is collecting information, and he writes a huge book of seerah. Now this book was very, very large. And another scholar, a generation after him, by the name of Ibn Hisham came, and he condensed it a little bit. And that became known as Seerat Ibn Hisham. It's the same book, written by Ibn Ishaq, but it was too large for the masses. And so it was condensed into, in our times, usually Seerat Ibn Hisham is in 4, 5, 6 volumes. So you can imagine Ibn Ishaq was much larger than this. So Ibn Hisham came, what did he do? He cut out repetitive stories, the same story in different versions. He cut out the names of people 10, 20, 30 generations. Ibn Ishaq recorded generations after generations, the so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so. Ibn Hisham came and he made it shorter, maybe 4 or 5 generations, and other simple modifications. He didn't add anything, and he didn't cut out anything important. He just summarized by cutting out that which was not that important. And this seerah became the most famous and the most classical book of seerah, Seerat Ibn Hisham. And it has been translated into all of the major language of the world. Even in English there is a partial translation, in Urdu, in many of the famous and classical languages of the Muslim world. Of course in Arabic, the original, it is available in every famous bookstore, Seerat Ibn Hisham. You can see that the books written on seerah were written very, very early on in Islam. Very, very classical. In fact, the books written on seerah were the first books ever written in Islam. Before Bukhari and Muslim came along, books of seerah had been written. Before any tafsir has been written, the books of seerah has been written. And this shows us the care and the concern that the early generations of Islam took in preserving the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. There are other sources as well. Time only permits us to allude to some of them. For example, there is a specific group of books dedicated to talking about the lives of the companions. Many of the scholars compile the lives of the companions. And so when you look at the lives of the companions, you also find bits and pieces of the seerah. The point being that whoever wishes to specialize in this science can indeed go back to the most classical and the most authoritative books of Islam. However, that is something that a scholar can do. To go back to the original books in the original language, meaning Arabic. Of course, all of the original books are written in Arabic. There is no other language in Islam that is sacred other than Arabic. So all of these books have been written in Arabic. But throughout the centuries, many people have written books about the seerah. And one of the most famous books and the most accessible books, and the book that I recommend the most for beginning students and beginning Muslims who want to just study about the seerah, is a book entitled Ar-Rahiq Al-Makhtoom. Ar-Rahiq Al-Makhtoom. In English it is called The Sealed Nectar. The Sealed Nectar, by a very great and a very dear scholar, a scholar whom Allah blessed me also to have the privilege and the luxury of studying under. I had a very good relationship with him as well. A great Indian scholar, and his name was Sheikh Safiyur Rahman Al-Mubarakfuri. He was from Mubarakfur. Sheikh Safiyur Rahman Al-Mubarakfuri. And this great scholar of Islam who passed away only a few years ago, he wrote a book of seerah in the late 70s, early 80s, around 1979, 1980, he wrote this book. And there was a worldwide contest announced by an organization in Mecca. They said, we want to award a prize to the best book of seerah written in our times. And so he wrote this book for this organization. And hundreds of people around the world wrote books for this competition. And his book was chosen to be the number one out of all of these hundreds of books, Sheikh Safiyur Rahman's books. And the reason is very obvious. When you see it, you will realize it. The language is simple. The incidents have been narrated in much graphical detail. He has compiled all of these classical sources and made it accessible. He has maps and diagrams. It is a very decent, interesting, simple book to understand. And it is a book that I recommend for all beginning people who want to study the seerah. This is the first book that they should read. In English, once again, it is called The Sealed Nectar. And in Arabic, it is called Ar-Rahiq Al-Makhtoom. And also the title in other languages, in Urdu as well, it is the same, Ar-Rahiq Al-Makhtoom, by my dear Sheikh Safiyur Rahman Al-Mubarakfuri. Inshallah ta'ala, in our next episode, we'll talk about the birth and the beginning life of the Prophet ﷺ. But before we get there, just to lay out what exactly was the political situation of the time. The Prophet ﷺ was born in the Arabian Peninsula. He was born in the Arabian Peninsula in the 6th century after Jesus Christ, the 6th century CE. And at that time, there were two major political powers of the world. Two major political empires. One of them to the east of Arabia and one to the west of Arabia. The one that was for the west of Arabia was the Roman Empire. Or to be more precise, it was the Eastern Byzantium Empire. The Roman Empire had split up into splinter empires, and so there was the Byzantium Empire.